The tension in courtroom 3A of the Federal District Court in Portland was palpable. Lawyers shuffled papers nervously as Judge Mustafa Kosabi entered, his expression unreadable beneath his composed judicial demeanor. The gallery was packed with observers, reporters, and community members for what many had expected to be a routine hearing on a contentious voting rights case. No one, least of all Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, who sat at the plaintiff's table, anticipated what would happen next. "Before we proceed with today's hearing," Judge Kosabi said, his voice resonating through the hushed courtroom, "I feel compelled to address something unusual that occurred in the filings for this case." The judge removed his glasses and looked directly at Congresswoman Crockett. "In my 15 years on the bench, I have never witnessed an attorney display such noteworthy bravery in the face of what can only be described as deliberate intimidation." A murmur swept through the courtroom. The defense counsel shifted uncomfortably. Judge Kosabi, an Obama appointee known for his measured temperament and scrupulous fairness, rarely made personal comments during hearing. The menacing messages Congresswoman Crockett received after filing this voting rights case were reprehensible. Yet instead of withdrawing, she not only persisted, but incorporated those very threats as evidence of the discouraging effect on voting rights. That level of moral bravery deserves recognition. Regardless of how I ultimately rule on the legal merits of this case, what happened next stunned everyone present. As Judge Kosabi finished speaking, something unprecedented occurred in the typically formal federal courtroom. An unplanned reaction that would be reported in law schools and media outlets nationwide. Before we reveal what happened in that noteworthy courtroom moment, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. We bring you stories of bravery and principle in America's justice system that remind us what's possible when public servants stand firm against intimidation. The case before Judge Kosabi had begun 3 months earlier, when several civil rights organizations represented by Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett in her capacity as an attorney filed a lawsuit challenging recent changes to voting procedures in a rural county. The changes had significantly reduced polling locations in predominantly minority neighborhoods, while leaving others untouched. Before entering Congress, Crockett had built a distinguished career as a civil rights attorney, winning several landmark cases involving voting access. Despite her congressional responsibilities, she had agreed to present plaintiffs in this case pro bono, citing its fundamental importance to democratic involvement. Judge Mustafa Kosabi brought unique perspective to the federal bench. Appointed in 2019, he was the first Muslim American federal judge in Oregon's history. His background included years as a workers' compensation judge and circuit court judge, where he had earned widespread respect for his meticulous attention to legal detail and even-handedness in politically charged cases. "I took an oath to apply the law equally to all who appear before me, regardless of their status or my personal opinions," he often reminded lawyers in his courtroom. In this court, the only thing that matters is evidence and legal reasoning. The dispute surrounding the case escalated significantly 2 weeks before the hearing when Congresswoman Crockett began receiving menacing messages after a local radio host criticized her involvement in the lawsuit. The messages sent to both her congressional office and personal email contained explicit threats and racial slurs. "What do you think about the increasing threats public servants face today? Has political intimidation crossed a dangerous line in our democracy?" Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective on protecting both civil discourse and public safety. Rather than withdrawing from the case as the anonymous intimidators clearly hoped, Crockett made an unexpected legal move. She amended the complaint to include theme-enacing messages as evidence of the discouraging effect that voting restrictions combined with intimidation could have on minority voters' willingness to participate in the democratic process. Legal experts immediately acknowledged the strategic brilliance of this approach. By incorporating the threats into the legal complaint, Crockett transformed personal intimidation into relevant evidence. The move not only strengthened the legal argument, but also created a public record of the intimidation tactics being employed. "This case isn't just about polling place locations," she explained to reporters outside the courthouse after filing the amended complaint. "It's about whether our democracy allows all citizens to participate without fear. The threats I've received simply underscore what many voters in marginalized communities already experience. The message that their involvement is unwelcome." The amended filing generated national attention. Legal blogs praised its creative approach to addressing intimidation, Civil rights organizations cited it as a model for responding to increasingly common threats against voting rights advocates. Conservative legal scholars, while disagreeing with the underlying claims, acknowledged the tactical sophistication of incorporating the threats into the case itself. The defense team representing the county election board found themselves in an uncomfortable position. While they had legitimate arguments supporting the polling place changes based on budget constraints and population shifts, they now face the additional challenge of distancing themselves from the menacing messages without appearing to dismiss their seriousness. As the hearing date approached, security at the federal courthouse was heightened. U.S. Marshals conducted additional screening. Judge Kosabi requested additional security measures, not out of personal concern, but to ensure all participants felt safe in his courtroom. The morning of the hearing, the courtroom filled early. Civil rights advocates sat alongside local citizens concerned about government overreach. Law students occupied several rows, notebooks ready to record what many professors had described as a textbook example of creative legal advocacy in voting rights cases. What no one anticipated was how Judge Kosabi would open the hearing, or the unusual response his remarks would prompt from those assembled in the typically formal federal courtroom. As Judge Kosabi entered the courtroom, the gallery rose according to protocol. The judge nodded to the lawyers and took his seat, arranging his papers methodically as was his custom. Those familiar with his courtroom acknowledged his thorough preparation. Case files tabbed and annotated, relevant precedents flagged for quick reference. "You may be seated," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. As the rustle of movement subsided, he looked up at the packed courtroom, making brief eye contact with various participants before delivering his unexpected opening remarks. "Before we proceed with today's hearing, I feel compelled to address something unusual that occurred in the filings for this case. In my 15 years on the bench, I have never witnessed an attorney display such noteworthy bravery in the face of what can only be described as deliberate intimidation." He removed his glasses and looked directly at Congresswoman Crockett. The menacing messages Congresswoman Crockett received after filing this voting rights case were reprehensible. Yet, instead of withdrawing, she not only persisted but incorporated those very threats as evidence of the discouraging effect on voting rights. That level of moral bravery deserves recognition regardless of how I ultimately rule on the legal merits of this case. Judge Kosabi continued, his voice measured but firm. "This court stands unequivocally for the proposition that intimidation of lawyers for their advocacy is an assault on the rule of law itself. Every attorney must be free to represent their client zealously, without fear of personal threats. This principle goes beyond partisan divides and goes to the heart of our legal system." He then addressed the broader implications. The threats described in the amended complaint are particularly troubling because they targeted Congresswoman Crockett not just as an attorney but as a public servant engaged in constitutionally protected activity. Such intimidation, if left unaddressed, threatens not only individual rights but the functioning of our democracy itself. The judge then shifted to establish clear expectations for the hearing. That said, this hearing will focus strictly on the legal questions before us. I expect all arguments to address the relevant statutory and constitutional provisions, applicable precedents, and specific facts of this case. Both sides will have equal opportunity to present their positions, and this court will evaluate them solely on their legal merits. This balanced approach, acknowledging the intimidation while committing to legal neutrality, set the tone for what followed. By addressing the threats directly rather than ignoring them, Judge Kosabi created space for substantive legal discussion, unclouded by the intimidation tactics. With preliminary matters addressed, the judge invited Congresswoman Crockett to present the plaintiff's case. She approached the podium with composed dignity, her preparation evident in the minimal notes she carried. "Your Honor," she began, "this case centers on a fundamental question: whether the recent polling place closures in Rosemont County violate Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment." What followed was a masterclass in precise legal advocacy. Crockett methodically outlined how the county's decision to reduce polling locations from 25 to 10 had disproportionately affected minority communities. Using maps, demographic data, and transportation statistics, she demonstrated that the closures created considerably longer travel times and wait times for minority voters compared to white voters. The evidence shows that 85% of closures occurred in census tracts where minorities constitute the majority population. Despite these areas representing only 35% of the county, this disparity cannot be explained by the county's stated rationale of population density or facility availability. She then addressed the legal standard established in Brnovich versus Democratic National Committee, showing how the challenge procedures created burdens that, while perhaps seeming modest in isolation, produced significant disparities in the opportunities for minority voters to participate in the electoral process. Throughout her presentation, Crockett maintained a tone of respectful advocacy, forceful in presenting evidence, but careful to avoid personalizing the dispute. Her arguments focused on systemic impacts rather than individual motivations, creating space for the court to find voting rights violations without necessarily imputing discriminatory intent to county officials. When addressing the menacing messages, she framed them not as a personal grievance but as evidence relevant to the legal claims. These threats, Your Honor, demonstrate precisely the climate of intimidation that can deter full involvement in democratic processes. When combined with structural barriers like reduced polling locations, such intimidation compounds the burden on already marginalized communities. The defense counsel representing the county election board then presented their case. Attorney Michael Richardson acknowledged the seriousness of the threats Crockett had received, while maintaining they were the actions of unidentified individuals unconnected to his clients. The county unequivocally condemns any menacing or intimidating behavior directed at counsel or any participant in this case. He stated, "Such actions have no place in our legal system or democratic discourse." He then presented the county's defense, arguing that the polling place reductions were necessitated by budget constraints and followed neutral criteria, including facility availability, population density, and voter turnout patterns. Using the county's own data, he attempted to show that the closures would not create significant disparities in access when factoring in early voting options and mail-in ballot availability. As Richardson concluded his argument, Judge Kosabi engaged both lawyers in probing questions that revealed his thorough understanding of voting rights jurisprudence. He pressed Crockett on whether the evidence demonstrated disparate impact sufficient to meet the Brnovich standard. He challenged Richardson on whether the county had adequately considered less restrictive alternatives that might achieve budget goals without concentrated impact on minority communities. Throughout this questioning, the judge maintained both intellectual rigor and personal respect for the lawyers. His questions were challenging but never dismissive, seeking to clarify rather than confront. This approach created a space where both sides could present their strongest arguments without personal antagonism. As the substantive arguments concluded, Judge Kosabi addressed scheduling matters. "I will take these arguments under advisement and issue a written opinion within 30 days. Given the approaching election, I recognize the time-sensitive nature of this matter and will work expeditiously while ensuring thorough consideration of all issues presented." Before closing the hearing, he returned to his opening theme with remarks that would capture national attention. "I want to acknowledge again the bravery demonstrated by counsel in this case. Our legal system depends on lawyers willing to advocate zealously despite personal risk." Congresswoman Crockett's response to intimidation, transforming threats into evidence that strengthens her legal case, represents advocacy of the highest order. He continued with words that would be quoted in law schools nationwide. "There is a special kind of bravery required to persist when faced with personal threats, a bravery that honors our profession's highest calling, to seek justice without fear or favor. This court cannot and will not allow intimidation to influence these hearings. The rule of law demands nothing less." As Judge Kosabi concluded his remarks, something unusual happened. A single person in the back of the courtroom began to applaud. Within seconds, the round of applause spread through the gallery, tentative at first, then building in intensity as more people joined in. Federal courtrooms rarely witness such unplanned displays. Decorum typically prohibits any audience reaction. Yet in this moment, the round of applause represented something more than approval of either side's legal position. It was an affirmation of bravery in defense of core democratic values that transcended partisan divides. The judge, momentarily surprised, made no move to silence the response. Instead, he allowed the brief expression of sentiment to run its course, understanding it reflected not partisan celebration, but recognition of the values he had articulated, the importance of a legal system where advocates can represent their clients without fear of personal reprisal. What made this moment particularly noteworthy was who participated in the round of applause. Court observers noted that it included not only civil rights advocates and progressive supporters, but also several conservative lawyers, local officials, and even some who had publicly supported the county's position on polling places. This wasn't partisan approval, but a genuine cross-partisan acknowledgement of Democratic bravery. Janet Miller, a retired federal prosecutor seated in the second row, later told reporters, "I've been in courtrooms for 30 years and never witnessed anything like it." You could feel the atmosphere change as people acknowledged this wasn't about politics, but about defending the fundamental integrity of our legal system. As the round of applause finally subsided, Congresswoman Crockett remained at the podium, visibly moved, but maintaining her professional composure. When the courtroom quieted, she addressed the court one final time. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion of the moment. "If I may, I'd like to acknowledge that whatever bravery I've shown pales in comparison to that displayed by ordinary citizens who face far greater barriers and risks in exercising their voting rights. They are the true inspiration for this case." This redirection of attention from herself to the communities she represented demonstrated why she had earned such respect, even from those who disagreed with her politics. By transforming personal recognition into advocacy for her clients, she reinforced the central purpose of the case itself. Judge Kosaba nodded in acknowledgement. "Your point is well taken, Congresswoman. This court recognizes that lawyers serve as voices for those whose own voices might otherwise go unheard in our legal system." Before adjourning, Judge Kosaba made one additional statement that further elevated the hearing beyond typical legal arguments. "This court has a responsibility not just to apply the law, but to protect the legal process itself. When lawyers face threats for their advocacy, it threatens not just individual rights but the functioning of our entire system of justice. Such intimidation, if left unaddressed, creates exactly the kind of discouraging effect on involvement that voting rights laws seek to prevent." With that, he closed the hearing. Court is adjourned. The impact of the moment continued as people filed out of the courtroom. Small groups formed spontaneously in the hallway, engaging in thoughtful conversation that crossed typical political divides. A county official was overheard speaking with a civil rights advocate about practical transportation solutions for affected voters. A conservative attorney engaged a progressive law student in discussion about the strategic brilliance of incorporating threats into legal arguments. Professor James Wilson, a constitutional law expert who had observed the hearing, gathered his students in the courthouse plaza. "What you witnessed today goes beyond the specific legal questions in this case," he told them. Judge Kosaba demonstrated how courts can affirm fundamental democratic values while maintaining judicial impartiality on contested legal questions. Congresswoman Crockett showed how advocates can respond to intimidation, not with retreat, but with innovative legal strategy that transforms threats into evidence, strengthening their case. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around Congresswoman Crockett. Rather than focusing on the legal details, most questions addressed the unusual courtroom moment and Judge Kosabi's recognition. "Congresswoman, how do you respond to the judge's comments about your bravery?" asked a reporter from the local newspaper. Crockett's response maintained the same principled focus she had demonstrated throughout. Judge Kosabi's remarks were generous, but what matters most isn't personal recognition, but the fundamental issues at stake in this case. Voter access isn't a partisan issue, but a democratic one. Every American deserves equal opportunity to participate in our electoral system without unnecessary barriers or intimidation. When asked specifically about the unplanned round of applause, Crockett reflected thoughtfully. "What moved me wasn't personal validation, but seeing that across our political differences, Americans still share fundamental values about democracy and the rule of law. That gives me hope that we can address even our most difficult challenges if we focus on these shared values, rather than partisan advantage." A reporter from a conservative news outlet asked whether the threats had made her consider withdrawing from the case. Crockett's answer revealed both her personal bravery and strategic thinking. "Honestly, yes. I considered it briefly, not out of fear for myself, but concern about potential distraction from the core legal issues. But then I realized that intimidation affecting advocates is exactly analogous to intimidation affecting voters. By incorporating these threats into our legal argument rather than retreating from them, we strengthen the case by demonstrating in real time the discouraging effect that intimidation combined with structural barriers creates. Her candid acknowledgement of vulnerability followed by explanation of her strategic response earned respect, even from media outlets typically critical of her politics. The authenticity of her answer, admitting initial concern before explaining her principled response, resonated with viewers across the political spectrum across the plaza. Defense attorney Richardson demonstrated similar professionalism when approached by reporters. While we maintain that the county's actions were legally justified by legitimate constraints, we join Judge Kosabi in condemning any intimidation directed at opposing counsel. The legal system functions only when all parties can advocate their positions without fear. When pressed on whether he agreed with an unplanned round of applause, Richardson showed noteworthy statesmanship. Some might consider it a breach of courtroom decorum, but in this instance, I believe it reflected something important. Recognition that certain values transcend our political differences. My clients oppose Congresswoman Crockett's legal arguments, but absolutely support her right to make them without intimidation. That's a value all Americans should share. By mid-afternoon, law professors nationwide were already incorporating the events into their teaching. Professor Elena Martinez at Georgetown Law sent an email to her professional responsibility students with video clips from the hearing, noting, "Today we witnessed a perfect example of how advocates can respond to intimidation with both bravery and strategic brilliance." Congresswoman Crockett's incorporation of menacing messages into the legal argument itself represents innovative advocacy of the highest order. By evening, video clips of the courtroom round of applause had spread across social media. The hashtag #Courage in Court began trending nationally, with Americans from across the political spectrum sharing the clip, alongside reflections on democratic values that transcend partisan division. News outlets from across the political spectrum covered the story, most focusing on the rare moment of unity the hearing had produced rather than the partisan aspects of the underlying case. CNN's legal analyst noted, "What we witnessed today goes beyond the specific legal questions in this voting rights case. Judge Kosabi's recognition of advocacy bravery and the unplanned response it generated remind us that certain values, the rule of law, the right to representation without intimidation, remain values that can unite Americans across political divides." Fox News, often critical of progressive voting rights litigation, surprised viewers with their legal correspondence assessment. Whatever one thinks about the underlying case, the conduct of these hearings demonstrates the best of our legal tradition. Judge Kosabi maintains strict neutrality on the legal questions, while standing firmly for the integrity of the legal process itself. Congresswoman Crockett showed how principled advocacy can be both passionate and professional. Local radio host Marvin Wells, whose criticism had preceded the menacing messages, used his afternoon program to distance himself from the intimidation tactics. I strongly disagree with the Congresswoman's position on voting regulations, but menacing an attorney for representing their clients is unacceptable in a democracy. We should challenge ideas with better ideas, not intimidation. That evening, several prominent legal organizations issued statements commending both Judge Kosabi's balanced approach and Congresswoman Crockett's innovative advocacy. The American Bar Association president noted, "Today's hearing reminds us that the rule of law depends on advocates willing to represent their clients zealously, despite personal risk, and courts willing to protect the integrity of legal processes while maintaining neutrality on the legal questions presented." As evening fell, legal experts on television panels discussed the significance of the day's events. Harvard law professor Martha Feldman observed, "What Judge Kosabi did today was noteworthy in its balance, recognizing the bravery displayed by Congresswoman Crockett while explicitly separating that recognition from his evaluation of the legal merits. He demonstrated how courts can affirm fundamental democratic values without compromising judicial impartiality." Stanford law professor James Chan added, "Congresswoman Crockett's legal strategy deserves study in every law school. When faced with intimidation, she didn't retreat or respond with counterattacks. Instead, she incorporated the threats into her legal argument itself, transforming personal attacks into evidence, strengthening her case. That's advocacy of the highest order." Perhaps most significantly, by late evening, the county commissioners held an emergency session to discuss the case. After a 3-hour closed meeting, they emerged with a surprising announcement. Rather than waiting for the court's ruling, They would work directly with community representatives to develop a compromised plan for polling locations that would address the concerns raised in the lawsuit while respecting budget constraints. Today's court hearing reminded us that ensuring voter access goes beyond partisan politics, said Commissioner Sarah Johnson, a conservative who had previously defended the polling place reductions. While we maintain the county acted legally, we recognize the importance of ensuring all citizens can participate in our democracy without undue burden. We're committed to finding solutions that work for all our communities. This unexpected development, direct dialogue replacing adversarial litigation, represented perhaps the most meaningful response to the day's events. The unplanned round of applause that had erupted in courtroom A had somehow created space for collaboration that partisan positioning had previously prevented. By nightfall, the hashtag courtroom bravery was trending nationally with Americans from across the political spectrum, sharing the video clip alongside their own reflections on democratic values that transcend partisan division. The unusual moment had captured something essential about American democracy: the recognition that despite deep divisions, certain values about fair involvement in democratic processes still unite citizens across political lines. The impact of Judge Kosabi's recognition and the courtroom's response extended far beyond the specific voting rights case. As analysis and coverage continued in the days following the hearing, the focus increasingly shifted from the partisan aspects of voting regulations to the broader values the incident had highlighted. Law schools requested court transcripts to incorporate into professional ethics courses. The exchange between Judge Kosabi and Congresswoman Crockett became required reading in classes on legal advocacy, judicial ethics, and voting rights litigation. Professors highlighted how Crockett's incorporation of themanizing messages into the legal argument itself represented innovative advocacy that transformed personal attacks into evidence, strengthening her case. The American Bar Association issued a statement 3 days after the hearing. The events in Judge Kosabi's courtroom remind us that the legal profession's highest calling is the bravery to advocate zealously despite personal risk. When lawyers face intimidation for representing their clients, the proper response isn't retreat, but redoubled commitment to the rule of law. National security experts and democracy advocates used the incident to highlight growing concerns about threats to public servants. A bipartisan congressional working group on protecting democratic institutions invited both Judge Kosabi and Congresswoman Crockett to provide testimony about the increasing intimidation faced by election officials, judges, and voting rights advocates. During her testimony, Crockett emphasized practical solutions rather than partisan narratives. This isn't about left versus right, but about preserving a system where disagreements are resolved through law rather than intimidation. We need enhanced security protocols, clear consequences for those who threaten democratic processes, and support systems for officials at all levels who face such threats. Judge Kosabi's testimony similarly focused on systemic responses rather than political framings. Our courts must be places where difficult questions can be addressed without fear. This requires not just physical security, but also a civic culture that respects the role of legal advocacy. Even amid meaningful disagreements about policy, perhaps most significantly, the incident catalyzed local dialogue in Rosemont County itself. Community leaders from diverse political backgrounds organized public forums to discuss voting access, moving beyond partisan talking points to address practical questions. How could the county meet budget constraints while ensuring all communities had reasonable access to voting? What transportation solutions might address barriers created by polling place consolidation? How could community organizations work with election officials to maximize involvement? These conversations didn't eliminate disagreements, but transformed how they were conducted, focusing on shared democratic values rather than partisan advantage. Local officials who had initially defended the polling place reductions began working with community representatives to develop compromised solutions, including mobile voting units, expanded early voting hours, and transportation assistance programs. 3 weeks after the hearing, Judge Kosabi issued his ruling with characteristic thoroughness. His 42-page opinion addressed complex legal questions while remaining accessible to non-lawyers. He granted a partial preliminary injunction requiring the county to reopen certain polling locations while allowing consolidation in areas where evidence of disparate impact was less compelling. Legal observers from across the spectrum noted the ruling's careful balance by focusing narrowly on specific evidence rather than broad pronouncements. Judge Kosabi provided a roadmap for addressing voting access concerns without judicial overreach. The opinion cited extensive factual findings about travel times, public transportation limitations, and historical patterns of voter involvement. Notably, both sides found aspects of the ruling to affirm. Voting rights advocates celebrated the reopening of key polling locations in underserved communities. County officials appreciated the court's recognition of legitimate budget constraints and the limited scope of the injunction, which preserved many of their consolidation plans while addressing the most problematic closures. Rather than appealing, county officials worked with community representatives to implement the court's order while developing longer-term solutions for future elections. This collaborative approach represented a dramatic shift from the adversarial positions that had characterized the initial dispute. 6 months later, the case study, Bravery in the Courtroom, Advocacy Under Threat, became part of the required curriculum at the National Judicial College, which trains judges from across the country. The program examined how judges can maintain neutrality on legal questions while firmly protecting the integrity of legal processes when advocates face intimidation. Judge Kosabi, invited to address the program, reflected on the values that guided his approach. The judge's role isn't to advance either side's policy preferences, but to create a space where legal questions can be fairly resolved. When intimidation threatens that process, defending advocacy bravery isn't partisan, but essential to the rule of law itself. The impact on Congresswoman Crockett's career was equally significant. While maintaining her progressive advocacy on voting rights, she became known for an approach that engaged opposing viewpoints with respectful strength rather than dismissive rhetoric. Law firms from across the country sought her counsel on complex civil rights litigation, recognizing that her innovative legal strategies transcended typical partisan approaches. When interviewed about her experience a year later, Crockett reflected on broader lessons. What I learned most profoundly was that bravery isn't the absence of fear, but the determination that some values matter more than personal comfort. Our democracy depends on citizens and officials willing to defend fundamental rights even when doing so carries personal risk. She added, I also discovered something unexpected, that standing firmly for values while maintaining respect for those who disagree often builds broader support than approach alienating potential allies. Defending voting rights doesn't require demonizing those with different perspectives, but demonstrating how equal access strengthens democracy for everyone. Perhaps the most lasting legacy emerged in law schools nationwide. The Kosabi-Crockett exchange, as it became known, is now studied alongside historic moments of judicial bravery, like Judge Frank Johnson's civil rights rulings in Alabama. Law students analyze how Judge Kosabi affirmed core democratic values, while maintaining judicial impartiality, and how Congresswoman Crockett transformed personal threats into legal advantage through creative advocacy. Constitutional law professor Diane Rodriguez at Yale Law School captured this educational impact. We teach the Kosabi-Crockett exchange not because it established new legal doctrine, but because it demonstrated something equally important: how judges and advocates can defend democratic institutions through personal bravery and professional excellence. These moments where principle goes beyond partisanship remind us why the rule of law matters. The unplanned round of applause that erupted in courtroom 3A that day represented something meaningful about American democracy. The recognition that certain values transcend our deepest partisan divides. In an era often characterized by partisan combat, Judge Kosabi's recognition of Congresswoman Crockett's bravery revealed a reservoir of shared commitment to core democratic values that remains a source of national resilience. As Judge Kosabi later reflected, what happened in that courtroom wasn't about progressive or conservative views on voting regulations. It was about something more fundamental: the bravery to defend democratic involvement against intimidation, and the recognition that such bravery deserves respect across political lines. In that moment of round of applause, I heard not partisan celebration, but affirmation of values essential to our constitutional order. If this story of bravery in defense of core democratic values inspired you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you examples of Americans standing firm for constitutional values, even amid deep partisan divides. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder that our democracy depends not just on laws and institutions, but on the personal bravery of those who defend them, sometimes at significant risk. The work of strengthening our democratic culture continues, and we'll be here covering the moments that matter.